Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Glad to be back with you again. And we'll be continuing to read in The Little House of the Prairie book by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Mr. Edwards meets Santa Claus. Here's the picture. Doesn't look snowy there. It looks wet. We'll see. The days were short and cold. The wind whistled sharply, but there was no snow. Cold rains were falling. Days after the rain fell, pattering on the roof. Day after day the rain fell, pattering on the roof and pouring from the eaves. Mary and Laura stayed close to the fire, sewing their 9-patch quilt blocks or cutting paper dolls from scraps of wrapping paper and hearing the wet sound of the rain. Every night was so cold they expected to see snow the next morning, but in the morning they only saw sad, wet grass. They pressed their noses against the squares of glass in the windows that Pa had made, and they were glad that they could see out. But they wished they could see the snow. Laura was anxious because Christmas was near, and Santa Claus and his reindeer could not travel without snow. Mary was afraid that even if it snowed, Santa Claus could not find them so far away in Indian territory. When they asked Ma about this, she said she didn't know. "What day is it?" they asked her anxiously. "How many more days till Christmas?" And they counted off the days on their fingers till there was only one day left. Rain was still falling that morning. There was not one crack in the gray sky. They felt almost sure there would be no Christmas. Still, they kept hoping. Just before noon, the light changed. Clouds broke and drifted apart, shining white in a clear blue sky. Sun shone, birds sang, and thousands of drops of water sparkled on the grasses. But when Ma opened the door to let the fresh, cold air in, they heard the creek roaring. They had not thought about the creek. Now they knew they would have no Christmas because Santa Claus could not cross that roaring creek. Pa came in, bringing in a big fat turkey. If it weighed less than 20 pounds, he said he'd eat it, feathers and all. He asked Laura, "How's that for Christmas dinner? Think you can manage one of those drumsticks?" She said yes, she could. She was sober. Then Mary asked if the creek was going down, and he said, "No, it's still rising." Ma said that was too bad. She hated to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking all alone on Christmas Day. A little crooked there. Mr. Edwards had been asked to eat Christmas dinner with them, but Pa said a man would risk his neck trying to cross that creek now. Then he shook his head. "No," he said, "the current's too strong. We'll just have to make up our minds that Edwards won't be here tomorrow." Of course, that meant Santa Claus could not get there either. Try that. Laura and Mary tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey. It was a very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by, and such a turkey for Christmas dinner. Ma said so, and it was true. Ma said it was too bad that Santa couldn't come this year, but they were such good girls that he hadn't forgotten them. He would surely come next year. Still, that didn't make them happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and faces, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and soberly said their prayers. They wore a hat that they tied under to help keep their head warm. It did not seem like Christmas time at all. Pa and Ma sat by the fire. After a while, Ma asked Pa why he didn't play the fiddle, and he said, "I don't seem to have the heart to, Carolyn." After a while longer, Ma suddenly stood up. "I'm going to hang your Christmas stockings, girls," she said. "Maybe something will happen." Laura's heart jumped, but she thought about the creek again, and she knew nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on either side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed covers. "Now go to sleep," Ma said, kissing them good night. "Morning will come quicker if you're asleep." She sat down again by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa said, "You've only made it worse, Carolyn." And she thought she heard Ma say, "No, Charles, there's the white sugar." But perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely. The door latch rattled and someone yelled, "Ingles! Ingles!" Pa was stirring up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning. The outdoors was gray. "Great fish hooks, Edwards! Come in, man. What happened?" Pa exclaimed. Laura saw the stockings limply dangling, and she scrooched her eyes shut into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards said that he'd carried his clothes on his head when he swam across the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He would be all right, he said, as soon as he got warm. And look what he looked like when he was crossing that creek. Guess he wanted dry clothes when he got there. "It was too big a risk, Edwards," Pa said. "We're glad you're here, but that's too big a risk for Christmas dinner." "Your little ones had to have Christmas," Mr. Edwards replied. "No creek could stop me after I fetched their gifts from Independence." Laura sat straight up in bed. "Did you see Santa Claus?" she shouted. "I sure did," Edwards said. "Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us?" Mary and Laura cried. Wait a minute." Mr. Edwards laughed, and Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings, as Santa had intended. She said they mustn't look. Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their bed, and he answered every question they asked him. They honestly tried not to look at Ma, and they didn't quite see what she was doing. When the creek was rising, Mr. Edwards said he had known that Santa Claus could not get across it. "But you crossed it," Laura said. "Yes," Mr. Edwards replied, "but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He couldn't make it where a long, lean razorback like me could do so." And so Mr. Edwards realized that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no farther than south than Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence. "In the rain?" Mary asked. Mr. Edwards said he wore his rubber coat. And there, coming down the street in Independence, he met Santa Claus. "In the daytime?" Laura asked. She hadn't thought that anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. No, Mr. Edwards said, it was night, but light shone out across the street from the saloons. Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, "Hello, Edwards." "Did he know you?" Mary asked, and Laura asked, "How did you know it was really Santa Claus?" Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knew everybody, and he recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the longest, thickest, whitest whiskers of anybody west of the Mississippi. So Santa Claus said, "Hello, Edwards. Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a corn shuck bed in Tennessee." Mr. Edwards well remembered that little red pair of mittens that Santa Claus had left for him that time. Then Santa Claus said, "I understand you're living down along the Vergus River. Have you ever met up down yonder with two young girls named Mary and Laura?" "I surely am acquainted with them," Mr. Edwards replied. "It rests heavy on my mind," said Santa Claus. "They are both of them sweet, pretty good little things, and I know they're expecting me. I surely do hate to disappoint two good little girls like them. Yet the water is way up. I can't even make it across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get to their cabin this year." "Edwards," Santa Claus said, "would you do me the favor to fetch them their gifts this one time?" "I'll do that with pleasure," Mr. Edwards told him. Then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching post where his pack mule was tied. "Didn't he have his reindeer?" Laura asked. "You know he couldn't," Mary said. "There isn't any snow." "Exactly," said Mr. Edwards. "Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest, and Santa Claus uncinched the pack and looked through it. And he took out the presents for Mary and Laura." "Oh, what are they?" Laura cried, but Mary asked, "Then what did he do?" Then he shook hands with Mr. Edwards and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa Claus rode well for a man of his weight and build, and he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. "So long, Mr. Edwards," he said as he rode away on the Fort Dodge Trail, leading his pack mule and whistling. This is what he looked like. I lost my place. Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking on that. Then Ma said, "You may look now, girls." Something was shining bright at the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace, and the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. Mary had one exactly like it. These new tin cups were their very own. Now they each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own little tin cup. Then they plunged their hands into the stockings again, and they pulled out two long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick, just one lick. But Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take one lick out of her candy. The stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out two small packages. They unwrapped them and each found a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains lay like tiny drifts of snow. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them, but at last Laura turned hers over and nibbled a tiny nibble from the underneath, where it wouldn't show, and the inside of the little cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Some of their gifts. Laura and Mary would never think to look in their stockings again. The cups and the cakes and candies were almost too much. They were too happy to speak, but Ma asked if they were sure the stockings were empty. Then they put their hands down inside them to make sure. And in the very toe of each stocking was a shiny, bright, new penny. They had never even thought of such a thing as having a whole penny. Think of it, a penny of your very own. Think of having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. There had never been such a Christmas. Now, of course, right away, Laura and Mary should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing those lovely presents all the way from Independence. But they had forgotten about Mr. Edwards. They had even forgotten about Santa Claus. In a minute they would have remembered, but before they did, Ma said gently, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. Edwards, thank you," they said, and they meant it with all their hearts. Pa shook Mr. Edwards' hand too and shook it again. Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards acted as if they were almost crying. Laura didn't know why. She gazed again at her beautiful presents. She looked up again when Ma gasped, and Mr. Edwards was taking sweet potatoes out of his pockets. He said they'd help to balance the package on his head when he swam across the creek. He thought Pa and Mom might like them with the Christmas turkey. There were 9 sweet potatoes. Mr. Edwards had brought them all the way from town, too. It was just too much. Pa said so. "It's too much, Edwards," he said. They never could thank him enough. Mary and Laura were too excited to eat their breakfast. They drank the milk from their shiny new cups, but they could not swallow the rabbit stew and the cornmeal mush. "Don't make them, Charles," Ma said. "It will soon be dinner time." For Christmas dinner, there was a tender, juicy roasted turkey. There were sweet potatoes baked in the ashes and carefully wiped so that you could eat the good skins. There was a loaf of salt rising bread made from the last of the white flour. And after all that, there were stewed dried blackberries and little cakes. But these little cakes were made with brown sugar, and they did not have white sugar sprinkled over their tops. Then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire and talked about Christmas times back in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank their water out of their new cups. And little by little they licked and sucked their sticks of candy till each stick was a sharp, pointed one on one end. That was a happy Christmas. And that's the end of the chapter. You know what I would love to have you do? I would love to have you leave me a comment about something that you remember from a very happy Christmas. I'll tell you real quick what I remember. I remember when I was very little, my brother Frank and I, we slept in the same bedroom. And we could hardly wait till Christmas. And we woke up knowing it's Christmas. And when we ran out, the Christmas tree was all lit up. And there were presents, it seemed like, everywhere. And we went running into Mom and Dad's room yelling, "Santa's been here! Santa's been here!" We were so excited. But you know what? My dad said, "It's too cold in the house. Go back to bed till I get the fire going." So Frankie and I, we had to go back to bed. But our bedroom was right next to where the fireplace was. And we could hear Dad. He was shredding the papers. Let me see if I can find a paper so you can hear that sound. Here's a paper. This is what it sounded like. See if I can shred it. We would hear this sound. We knew Dad was getting ready to put the kindling on the fire next. And we were listening really carefully. And Dad put the kindling on the fire. And then he put some logs on the fire. And he lit it with a match. And in a little while, because we were listening so carefully, we could hear snap and pop of the fire starting. It was a great sound. And in just a little while then, Dad came to the room and he said, "All right, got the fire going and the house is warming up. You can get up." And you know what Frankie and I did? We jumped out of bed and we went running as fast as we could into the living room. So that's my memory. I hope you share one with me. I'll be back tomorrow and read you the next chapter. All right, good night. I love you, I really do. But more importantly, God loves you.